Well, hello. So next up, we're going to take a look at regions and zones. This is kind of a longer section, so I'll try to be brief and I'll make some smaller, uh, kind of deeper sections on each of these content areas, being regions, availability zones, local zones, wavelength zones, and AWS Outposts. So let's go over this. EC2 is hosted in multiple locations worldwide. Okay, it's composed of regions, availability zones, local zones, outposts, and wavelength zones. So a region is a geographic part of the world, so like the East Coast or Ireland or the West Coast, something like that. And the availability zones are like isolated areas or data centers inside of that region. So there's not very many regions. I think there's like 25 or something. And then inside those regions, you've got two, sometimes three, four, I think up to five in some cases, availability zones. And then each side, um, inside those zones, is where you're going to host your infrastructure. You can span resources across multiple availability zones. You can even span it across multiple regions. Local zones are kind of like an availability zone, except it's going to be probably like outside of that area. And the whole idea is that you're providing low latency resources that are extremely close to wherever your customer or endpoint is. The downside to using a local zone is you really have to look at what services are available in the region, because it's not always 100% positive that you're going to have every service available in that region. But in the case of EC2, you should be fine. Outposts are pretty unique. You can take all the AWS core services, and we'll just talk about it in the context of EC2, and you can actually bring that into a data center or a colo or an on-prem facility. So imagine like a giant rack that is put into your on-prem data center, which is like a little mini version of an AWS uh, cloud. So you can run EC2 on it, you can run S3 on it. It's like if you were to take a portable AWS cloud and throw it in your data center, it's this tall rack that you just stick in there. I imagine it's quite expensive, but that's what an outpost is. And then you have wavelength zones. Wavelength zone is kind of like I compare it to an edge location, but we haven't talked about that yet. But it's basically a way to get content as close to a 5G cellular endpoint as possible. So I would almost call it like a content delivery network. But the whole idea is to have ultra low latency on a 5G network. So that's a wavelength zone. It talks about, they've got these high tech data centers. Even though they have data centers that are super high tech and it's owned by Amazon, they do fail. So it is possible to have an availability zone go down. I've actually seen a region go down before, so it's definitely good to plan for resilient, highly available architecture, and maybe span across a couple different availability zones. So in the event of power failure or a weather event of some kind that renders an availability zone unavailable, that your services are minimally impacted, hopefully not impacted by that. So yeah, things happen, right? So that's just kind of what to know. So we kind of went over all this at a high level. So getting into it just a little bit more. I'm not going to go too deep because I'm going to do each of these individually actually. So a region is isolated from every other region, whereas availability zones kind of all belong to the same region. So as you can see, here's an example where US East 1 is a region, and that's completely separate from EU West 1, which would be in Europe. If you are going to do cross-region, like data replication or something like that, then you do have an extremely high level of fault tolerance and stability, but that's going to come at a price. So you need to make sure you understand what the requirements are. If your requirement is to provide a cost-effective solution for high availability, you probably want to span across availability zones. If you need to build something that is more focused on what is the absolute most stable architecture you could design, it's going to be over multiple regions. That's going to give you multiple availability zones within 2 different regions in this case. So when you're going through and looking at that, just keep that in mind. The AMIs, it's worth noting, when you launch an instance, let's say in this example in East 1, you need to make sure that the AMI in US East 1 is available in EU West 1, because you can't really replicate things over or build the same things if the same resources are not there. So it says if the AMI in another region, you can copy the AMI to the region you're using. So if, in that case, if it's not there, you just need to do a little bit of planning. And you should have your own registered AMIs. I highly recommend doing that and not just using the AWS marketplace for all your images. You should. That's a great place to go to get them. But once you get them and you tweak them and whatnot, you should be taking snapshots and creating your own AMIs for your purposes. Because things do change. You know, things AMIs can get upgraded, and you don't know what kind of implication that's going to have on your infrastructure or on your application. There is a charge for data transfer between regions because you're going outside of your region. Anytime you go outside of your region, you're going to get charged for egress traffic. Okay, so just keep that in mind, and pricing stuff we'll go over later. So contents, available regions. So let's start there. Your account determines the regions that are available to you. So if you have an AWS account, it provides multiple regions so you can deploy EC2 wherever you need to meet your requirements. If you're using like AWS GovCloud, for example, US West provides access to the US West region and GovCloud US East region. So there's a little bit of a limitation there. So if you're using GovCloud, you don't have as many options. An AWS China account provides access to Beijing, in this other word I can't pronounce, regions only. So keep that in mind. So your account to some degree has an impact on it, but really it only matters if you're in China or if you're using GovCloud. GovCloud is definitely something you want to remember in the back of your head because that does come up from time to time. Here's a list of the codes and the names of the regions and what local zones are available in these regions. These regions also have multiple availability zones. We'll get into that, but this gives you an idea. There's a lot of regions. Okay, there's a lot. So regions and endpoints. If you're working with EC2 using command line and you're using an API, you have to specify a regional endpoint. So if you're looking more toward the developer side of things, just keep in mind that there are certain requirements in order to get to where you need to go. And there's quotas for that. There's limits on APIs, things like that. So definitely check out your EC2 endpoints and quotas before you start trying to use APIs to leverage these services in these different regions. Same thing goes for GovCloud. So for describing the regions, you kind of heard me talk about it up there when they give the example. If you go into the console in EC2, you can kind of see, like, here's a region. You can see I'm in the whatever it is region, US West 1. So you'll see US West, like right here, Oregon is US West 2. The US West 1 would be in Northern California, stand corrected. US East 1, so all these names are associated with a geographic location, and so you can kind of choose which region you want to get to based on name, and also, especially if you're doing it programmatically, you're going to need to know this actual like US East 1 instead of Northern Virginia. These are displayed on the dashboard, and you can also find them through the CLI. So I had a little bit from this earlier. So I'm rocking my Windows computer right now, and I went ahead and used the Windows terminal. So I've got PowerShell on this tab, and I've got Ubuntu running on this tab, just to show you kind of the differences between these two. So it says here you can find the region using the AWS CLI. So I installed the AWS CLI on the Ubuntu side, so you can see what this looks like. Now I have my default settings set to JSON. So when you see the output, you're going to see JSON. So here's a JSON output using the AWS EC2 describe regions command, and here's your regions. Here's your key, and the value is a list, and in this list we have another key and a value, and you've got your endpoint and your region name. And don't worry about the opt-in status stuff for now, but basically here's the region and the endpoint you would need. And you'll notice that to find the endpoint, it's just ec2 dot the name of the region dot amazonaws.com. So if you're a developer and you're working on this, you'll probably use this enough to you kind of figure out that pattern pretty quickly. If you do have regions that are disabled for your account, especially if you're using GovCloud and stuff, you'll notice that you can also run with a flag -- all regions, and it will list every region, not just the ones your account is authorized to use. Okay. If you want to find your region using the PowerShell tool, they've got some pretty cool commandlets for PowerShell on this PowerShell module. Get EC2 region. The one thing I like about this is it's listed in this fancy PowerShell table format, so you can kind of see it, I think, much easier here, but I don't know that it's as flushed out as the AWS CLI, but I'm not an expert in the AWS tools for Windows PowerShell. Getting the region name gets a lot trickier, especially as soon as you start looking at some of the stuff like AWS Lightsail, get regions -- query, and now you're doing some matching .display name and then output the text, and it gets kind of hairy pretty quick. So if we're doing US2, for example, and I don't have any resources here, but if I did have some resources, I could see what this would be using. So like watch, if I copy this and I put it in here. Yeah, see, I don't have an endpoint there because I don't have anything running there. So these are ways you can kind of query this stuff to get information. So if you're trying to build something dynamically, you can do that. Now, I would recommend setting up global variables for this kind of thing, so you're not having to query this, because once you get your stuff set up, it's likely that this region's not going to change. However, US, any region, US West 1, availability zone A, might be a different actual data center for you than if I were to create something in US West 1A, which is kind of confusing, so don't worry about it too much. But if you're a more advanced user, you may not know that, so it's worth noting. So whenever you're going to create a resource of some kind from AWS, you have to specify the region. Don't worry too much about all the crazy specifics in here. If you have questions about the command line, just go look it up, because this stuff, this kind of stuff doesn't change too much, but if I tell you what it is now, you'll never remember it. So there's no real sense in going through it, especially because this isn't, if you're trying to use this content to study for an exam, the only way to do this, to learn this, is to do hands-on. So listening to me talk about it's not going to do any good. All right, so going into availability zones. Each region has multiple isolated locations known as availability zones. When you launch an instance, you can select one or just say, hey, I don't care, I don't have a preference. It will distribute your resources across multiple availability zones, so if one fails, you can design your application so that it goes to the other availability zone. It's basic load balancing, right? You can use an elastic IP. Now, we talked about static IPv4 addresses for dynamic EC2 instances having an elastic IP address, and that may have sounded like kind of counterintuitive. But you can use this elastic IP address to mask the failure of an instance in one availability zone by rapidly remapping the address. It's kind of like DNS. So basically, if this zone goes down, and on the front right here you have an elastic IP address, it's able to just reallocate that IP address to the next available zone that you can use, the availability zone, so that from front end, if somebody's hitting your endpoint using an elastic IP address, that elastic IP address is just going to route traffic. It's not going to route traffic, but the traffic is routable via the elastic IP address to dynamic resources underneath of it. So that's why it's called an elastic IP address. And we'll get more into that on the networking side of the house. So anyways, each one of these has an ID. You can use the ID for coordinating this kind of like cross account type stuff. So it's definitely something you'll have to keep into consideration. All you need to know from this is just that, hey, it's possible to use resources across accounts. Okay, they're always adding availability zones, and so as they expand, your ability to expand can become constrained. So they might restrict you from launching an instance in a constrained availability zone unless you already have something there. So if you ever played a video game or anything that requires you to log into a server, if it's full, you're going to have to go to a low population server. Same kind of deal. Eventually, they might remove the constraint as they start adding resources and things like that. So you might have a different number of availability zones in a region than somebody else. Kind of like when we ran this command here to show all of them. So your regions might be different than another person's regions based on the restrictions for that availability zone at the time that person's account's trying to provision resources. So describing them, it is also possible with the CLI to use the describe availability zones and then do a region name. I think I'm using US East West 2. Yeah. So if we try that here on the CLI, region US West 2, and here you go. So here are my availability zones. I've got 2A, 2B, 2C, and 2D. Not all regions have 4, okay? And I don't know if I have, let's check West 1, which is, yeah, look, there's only a B and a C. But there is an A, but it's probably really populated, and I don't have access to provision stuff there right now. So this is a great example of that. So anyways, you can do all of them if you want to know all of them. I can go ahead and put that in here. Not that it's probably going to do you any good, but if you need to find availability zones with PowerShell, you can do the same thing. And let's just look at this for the difference in formatting. I'm really impressed with the PowerShell module for this. I think it's just really cool. So show me everything in US West 1. So you can, it's just your standard PowerShell output. It's very, very, very easy to read. It's organized. The table is really nice. In this case, if you really like JSON, you might have no problem reading this. But to me, I think availability zones, when you have these blocks of key value pairs, it's not too bad. But when you go up into here, like, it's just so hard to read, and you can just see like when we went and got the regions, it's all right there. It's very easy. You can screenshot the entire thing if you need to send to somebody. It's very easy. So now what about launching instances? So when you launch it, you select a region, right? And then if you put that you don't have a preference, it's just going to stick it wherever it's doing its own load balancing. But ideally what you want to do is you want to put it to the closest place you can get to your customer. Unless you have a legal requirement where, let's say that you're doing a FedRAMP, right? So you got to use ITAR resources, and everything has to be in the United States. So in that case, if you have a customer in Ireland, well, they're going to go to US East 1 something, and you can pick an availability zone that's closest to them. There's a tool you can use to kind of check latency for that kind of stuff, but it changes so often. I don't know if it's super worth it to use it, but it is out there if you want to check it out. Just Google AWS network latency tool, and it'll show you. So it's especially useful, I think, mostly for CDNs for like S3 and if you're doing content delivery networks. So migrating. So if you're going to take an instance and you're going to migrate it to another AZ, Um, yeah, that's pretty much what this says. You just need to be able to make sure that the instance type is there. And if you do need an AMI, that you take the AMI with you, so you can create an AMI out of the original one. This is like exam question 101 right here. If you're going to do a migration, so you create an AMI from the original instance, and then you launch the instance in the new availability zone with the AMI, and then you're good to go. So that's pretty much the process. It's pretty easy. If you're going to do it to another AZ, you just got to make sure that you've got all the same resources there. That's all. Um, Usually that's only an issue when you're going from somewhere like Northern Virginia to like Oregon or somewhere smaller, because Northern Virginia has like everything. So if you're going from there to somewhere else, it's kind of harder. But if you're going like from Oregon to Virginia, you probably don't need to worry about anything. If the original instance has an elastic IP associated with it, you're going to have to associate that with a new instance. So there's a process of disassociating an elastic IP. Once you have resources associated with an elastic IP, it's kind of like that's what it belongs to. So you might have to do some little tweak in there, some changes. If you have the original instance of reserve instance and you change it, these are also, if you're going to do a migration, you have to keep these things in mind as well. So the instance type is also something basically you need to take into account when you reserve it. Is the AMI, the instance type. Those are the two main things. And if you want to, you can get rid of the original one. But if you're trying to do high availability across regions, then obviously don't do that. And then we get into local zones. So I talked about this is kind of an extension of a region. It's not really an AZ, and the key is that it's the geographic proximity to users. One example I saw, is LAX. So like the airport, maybe they have their own deal. They have so much traffic that they probably need their own, and the latency requirement is so low that they need something super, super, super close. It does have their own connection with a direct connect. I'll get into that on the network side of the house, but basically it's a direct connection from a data center to Amazon using the Amazon backbone network. So it's super, super low latency, does not traverse the internet. So you can use that to do the local zone, and that's how it keeps that low latency communication. The way that this reads is it's the region code and then dash the local zone. So if you see that and it looks weird, that's what that is. It's a local zone. To use it, you have to enable it. That's a whole process on its own. As far as EC2 goes, don't worry about it too much. Just know that local zones are a thing. You can use them, and you can run EC2 instances on them. Again, staying in the scope of EC2. You don't need to worry about any of this right now. So the describing local zones, you can do the same thing using the commands, using the CLI or the PowerShell. You can list those out as well. We'll get a lot more into the CLI side of things. I think what I'm going to do with a lot of this stuff when we start provisioning EC2 stuff, I did a couple things last time, but it was just quick little stuff, is we'll do it with PowerShell, and we'll do it with the CLI, and we'll do it in the console. As I get further into this, I'll probably also do it with the Cloud Developer Kit or the CDK, and with CloudFormation and with Terraform, and just kind of go, which one's easier, which one's more manageable, which one's more readable, which one scales better as far as administrative overhead, which one's more prone to error, that kind of stuff. I think it's just good to know. I like to build stuff different ways and just see what's the big deal. A lot of people make fun of people that use the GUI, but in some cases the GUI is way faster. If you've ever tried to create an RDS database with a whole bunch of specifications from the command line, that line of code gets very ugly very quick, and it's just a click, 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 click in the console. So in some cases it's easier, but in other cases it's, is it manageable and scalable to do it from the console? No, absolutely not. Is there going to be error? Maybe. There's no way of knowing, and there's no audit record. So once it's built, it's built. So anyways, launching instances in a local zone, much like you're doing it in the regular AWS cloud, you specify a subnet for where it is. You can allocate an IP address. All that stuff's unique, and again uses the different naming convention with the region and then the local zone. So you enable it, you create a VPC, get yourself a subnet, get an IP address, launch it, boom, you're done. That's pretty much it. And then the last one is Wavelength Zones, and this is the 5G network I was talking about. The AWS Wavelength enables developers to build apps that deliver ultra-low latency to mobile device and end users. That's really all you need to know about Wavelength Zones, unless you're working with all this stuff all the time and doing a lot of mobile development. Dive in, be my guest. But as far as EC2 goes, all you need to know is that this is a thing that exists and that it has to do with 5G for mobile devices. And that's pretty much it. What does this have to do with EC2? Well, it's more like the gateway, and then once all that gets in, well, then the carrier gateway is what it's hitting, and then you would build your EC2 instances in a VPC or within a region that is within that 5G low latency endpoint. So that's a little bit about wavelengths. As far as how to build them, you can always look it up, but as if you're noticing a pattern here, you can list them with the same command that you use for everything else. You have to enable it and then create a VPC, create a subnet, assign an IP address, create the instance. It's all the same. So it's basically the same process for everything. The only difference is, and I'll scroll back to the top, for a region and availability zone, you don't need to enable anything. Okay, but for a local zone and wavelength, you need to enable them first. These are just available all the time for everyone. Okay. And then last, we go to AWS Outposts and see what this is about. So this is a fully managed service that extends AWS to on-prem, which is basically what I talked about earlier. You can get a pool of compute and storage capacity, take it to your customer site, and AWS will monitor it and manage it just like they manage any other AWS region, but it's like a little outpost. It's just a little AWS tower rack guy living in your data center, colo, whatever. Let's see if we can find an image. So if I go to AWS Outposts and I go to images, see if there's, look at this stud. There you go. There it is in all its glory. So you can get an outpost in there in your data center, and it's like having a little tiny AWS cloud right there in your data center. I think this is cool, and one of the reasons is there's a lot of things you can do with hardware and licensing for your existing licenses and existing hardware, where you can actually provision EC2 resources or any AWS resources that are available in an outpost right there in your data center and run a private cloud on Amazon resources. And I just think that's cool. Like having the ability to do RDS, a managed database, on-prem, like that's amazing. And I think it's super helpful for migration. So if you're in a hybrid situation, you're thinking about migrating, but you've got tons of Oracle licenses or you got lots of VMware licenses, you can get these dedicated hosts on-prem and even do like an outpost on-prem. And you could basically do an entire migration to AWS without leaving your data center. And then at some point you can change those instance types to be like reserved instead of dedicated, or on demand, or spot, or whatever. And you can get rid of the outpost altogether once you get all your stuff provisioned in the proper, like the AWS cloud proper. And you could basically do an entire migration, but it gives you time to do it. Now, I will tell you that it is a very expensive, neat little trick that you that you have at your disposal. So spend your budget wisely. So as far as launching instances, there's a little bit of a difference on Outpost, and that's because we're talking about hardware now, right? So you can launch it, but security groups control that's your network or your firewall, right? In an Outpost subnet, and to connect it, you have to specify a key pair. So there's a little bit of an extra step there with the connection. There's some specifics on route volumes and specifying data volumes with block device mapping for the AMI. So if you have infrastructure people or you yourself are infrastructure people, this probably makes a ton of sense to you. It does to me. So, but I'm definitely more on the cloud side than the developer side. So just know that there's a couple steps that you need to take in order to use an outpost. And if you're using an outpost, you probably have a professional or enterprise level AWS account, and you should reach out to your technical account manager on the details of obtaining and getting support for an AWS Outpost, which, by the way, they do support for you. Creating a volume, as you can see here, you start to get a little bit more complicated. This is just the command line version of saying, hey, create an ABS volume in this zone on this outpost. This outpost has this ARN, and this is the ARN number, and then so it tells you where it's going to mount. It's kind of like think of it as like a SCSI number or a UUID, like the actual device that this is going to be mounted to. So anyways, that is the overview of regions and zones. In the next section, I'm going to go over, this is what we call part of the AWS global infrastructure, which I've got up here, and I'm actually going to jump straight into another video and talk about the AWS global infrastructure. So thanks for joining me, and I hope you learned something. Have fun building stuff.